Oh my God, I did an intro without ruining it. Holy cow. Welcome, folks. It's Me, the Guerrilla Economist, coming to you live on this special edition of Rogue News. And we have with us Cynthia Chung, who needs no introduction. And if you don't know who she is one half of the dynamic duo that makes up RisingTideFoundation.net as well as CanadianPatriot.org. Cynthia is the editor-in-chief, the co-founder of the Rising Tide Foundation. She's lectured on topics of Schiller's aesthetics, Shakespeare's tragedies, Roman history, the Florentine resistance, among other subjects. She's a writer for Strategic Culture Foundation and a contributing author to the book series Clash of the Two Americas, one of my perennial favorites. Order yours, folks. I'm always pitching Matthew Ayer's book. She's one of the contributing authors to that voluminous series. And also in 2022, she authored her latest book, which I cannot wait for her to go into it. And I can't wait for you to buy it because it is definite recommended reading for yourself. And it should be an integral part of your library. And the book that we're going to be talking about today is The Empire on Which the Black Sun Never Set, the birth of international fascism and the Anglo-American foreign policy. That's international fascism. Fascism. Jeez, too much coffee today. Anyway, with that being said, Cynthia, welcome. It is a pleasure to have you back on.
Thank
What's
you for having
new? I mean, tell us about this book. This is exciting.
Yeah, I know. Who would think that people would get excited over a book on fascism? But a lot of people are seeing where the wind is blowing, and they're a little bit confused as to how we could find ourselves in such a situation, which seems like just in a matter of a few years. And so many people didn't see it coming. Basically, the book is an overview of 20th century fascism and how, in particular, after World War II, we were led to believe that we had defeated fascism, when in fact, the reality of the situation was that leadership on both sides, the Allies and the Axis, were in support of fascism before the war, during the war, and afterwards, and that when the Germans supposedly lost, there was already an agreement between the Germans and other fascists as well to just basically continue their plan, but not with such an offensive action. They kind of went underground somewhat in some of the things that they did with the stay behind secret armies of NATO. And then other things was to take over institutions like the United Nations, and also Kalergi's pan-Europeanism, this concept of the League of Nations as well from Woodrow Wilson was basically just reinstated after Roosevelt's death. So a lot of people didn't understand that those ideas like the League of Nations and pan-Europe were inherently supportive of fascism. And pan-Europe is, Kalergi is basically the spiritual father of the European Union today, which explains a lot of why Europe is in the situation it was. And I mean, we can get further into it in terms of the League of Nations was the blueprint for the New World Order. And the United Nations, which was not supposed to be that, was turned into that upon Roosevelt's death, who died 2 weeks before the first United Nations conference.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. I mean, most people think that at the end of World War II, that the only thing that seeped out of Germany and into the United States was Operation Paperclip with the bringing over of Nazi scientists. But people often forget that the very rudiments and foundations of philosophies that gave rise to Hitler were already things that were circulated within technocratic circles here in the United States itself. So, Cynthia, please, get us into that. What happened? What were these agreements? Even during the middle of World War II, when it looked like the Germans were about to lose, what are some of these agreements that were starting to circulate and foment and gain influence, especially within the decision-making circles in the Western world?
Well, I guess I'll start people off. The last time I was on the show, I talked about the special relationship between Britain and the United States that was declared by Churchill in his Iron Curtain speech. And in that chapter, which is it's a chapter within the book, I go over how the United States, even though, as Matt has made clear, I'm sure at this point there's been two Americas. The America that was anti-imperial and stood for a completely different vision of humankind as something that has creativity, that has value in the individual, which is ultimately a sacred potential, and it's a form of wealth. Um, that this idea was really revolutionary in terms of a historical advent in like an economic system that could really oppose a system of empire. And this system was really taking over. Henry C. Carey had organized the Centennial Exhibition, which had, I think, over 30 million people who had attended this exhibition from all around the world. About 27 countries participated, and it was to share the economic discoveries in the machine tool industry that the United States had implemented within such a short span, right? 100 years of it forming itself as a country. So you had Germany, you had Japan, Russia, and China, who were all leaders in starting to implement what we call the American system economics, which Henry C. Carey has written about extensively. And this was to promote national sovereign nation states, sorry. And again, if you have sovereign nation states, you can't have really a system of empire. And it was focused on economic independence and the ability to implement economic ideas that would create prosperity and wealth for its people. So this was really bad news for empire, and there's a lot of evidence to believe that the First World War was basically launched to upset this type of partnership that was going on internationally, and to create division amongst these countries, so that it became really hard to have economic partnerships with like Germany, and then after World War II, Germany and Japan for the Western side, and then on top of it, you know, Churchill launched the Iron Curtain, which then divided Russia and China. So all of these countries, it became increasingly, there was more pressure that you couldn't communicate, which was, this is very bad news if you want to have that appropriate structure to have that independence from imperialism. So after the First World War, you also had the phenomenon where all of the empires had also collapsed, but that was because it was a failing system. And I think that they knew that this was going to be also a consequence. And the League of Nations was the concept to reboot the system of empire. And it had the concept that there would be about 6 regionalizations in the world. Africa and Arabia would be largely slave colonies. And you'd have America, Britain, you could say a revived Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russia, China, and Japan as parts of these 6 regionalizations. But Britain, and this was made very clear, right? You had people like Leo Amery and Churchill and many others that were backing Kalergi's view in Britain, but they were very much clear that Britain would never be a part of a European Union. They would be something of their own. And in fact, they would be a sort of overseer of all of the regions of empire. So they would be the ultimate, you know, empire, you could say, because they argued they had interests in already in every sphere. So Kalergi, who comes from Austria, the nobility, he had a background actually, which is interesting. His Coudenhove, I don't know if I'm saying his name properly, Richard Coudenhove Kalergi. His background, he wrote A Crusade for Pan-Europe, which was his kind of first autobiography explaining his idea for Pan-Europe, which is, it's a little bit cleaned up, but at the same time, very telling of how much he was for fascism and working with the fascists. And ultimately, he says that, this all starts from my family going back to the Crusades. And the flag for Pan-Europe is the Crusade flag. And there's a lot of elements of Catholic fascism, to the point where he even says that, Pope Pius XII, who was the Pope during Mussolini's rule, once he had sided with Hitler from 1938, I think, or 1939 on, that Pope never criticized what was going on. And he was like, why should he? Catholicism is inherently a fascist order. So you had this kind of element there, that fascism was actually quite popular in a lot of places. And I think that a lot of people thought that it was going to be a shoo-in. And so there was a lot of heavy organizing. What's interesting, too, is that it wasn't just fascists that were for this plan for Pan-Europe, including Oswald Mosley, and Churchill also was calling for Kalergi's plan by name. But you also had certain Marxists and the Second International that were also supporting this. And, one part near the end of the book, I'm also going over a little bit of the James Burnham Trotsky connection. And Trotsky, too, has ties with working with the fascists. And James Burnham is considered a spiritual father of neoconservatism. And they were ultimately all working in support of this fascist idea. So when you think about it, looking at everything that was working towards this, it's quite amazing that it was forced to go underground. And, that's why James Burnham wrote The Managerial Revolution in 1941, confident that Nazism was pretty much going to be implemented on an international basis, including within the United States. But it was resisted, namely from Roosevelt and Stalin's partnership, which was very opposed within the United States. It was said, that the United States should not intervene in such a war. And it's very clear when you look at where the loudest voices for that were. These were people who wanted fascism to come, like Britain and France as well. It was the same thing. Like there was no mobilization towards fighting Hitler or Mussolini if they had decided to enter the country. Bertrand Russell, who's a Fabian. The Fabians play a prominent role in the story. Bertrand Russell, H.G. Wells. They were making the argument that if you resist, you're no different. And the idea was to have as peaceful of a transition to fascism as possible.
It's incredible. So what you stated is very powerful. Most people don't realize is that. Describe for us the difference, how they set up the League of Nations, and how that is fundamentally different from when Roosevelt came to power, and how the quote unquote the initial United Nations was. I think a lot of Americans miss that, and in fact, a lot of people in the world miss that.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, is that the First World War, again, was a bit of a setup, because if you look at, there's like one part in chapter 2, A Crusade for Pan-Europe, where I go over Kalergi. First makes a tour of Europe, then he goes to Britain. He meets with certain people, which are very telling. They're all like pro-fascists. Some are more subdued about it. They're not as public about it. And then he has Max Warburg organizes his tour in the United States, and he meets with a whole bunch of people that he names by name, the most significant ones. And if you look at the bios of all of these men, including J.P. Morgan and Lamont and Edward Mandell House and so forth, all of them have ties to Woodrow Wilson, Walter Lippmann. They all have ties to Woodrow Wilson. They played some role within the League of Nations or the Council for Foreign Relations, which is the American branch of Chatham House. And they often also play a role in the Treaty of Versailles. Even Kalergi writes in his autobiography that it was the Treaty of Versailles and the 1920s Depression which allowed Hitler to come into power. And there was no way that Hitler was going to be able to have that amount of influence over the people if it weren't for those two economic situations. So it's very interesting that all of these people play a role in that. They play a role in the Dawas and the Young Plan, which set up the International Settlements Bank. So there's all of this ties. I think Matt has already made it very clear that J.P. Morgan was also involved in an attempted coup attempt against Roosevelt within his first year of being president. So it's clear that they knew where that was going.
Yeah.
So you had all of these things that were very much working for a very clear agenda. And when Roosevelt came in, Roosevelt is the reason why I think people are so confused about Roosevelt. People have a hard time understanding, but I mean, they have to realize that this is the nature of the game, right? Like if you're surrounded with a bunch of vipers, you're surrounded with a bunch of like enemies, you can't just simply say, hey, my plan is to upset everything that you're working towards. Like that would be very silly. And they have to be somewhat, they cannot be fully transparent, unfortunately, when they're talking to the American public, either in certain ways of like what the plan is. So Roosevelt would speak well of Woodrow Wilson. He would speak well of the League of Nations. But if you look at it, he never supported it. And when Kalergi actually visited the United States to basically set up this revival of the League of Nations, because at that point, it was like considered a dead duck. So Kalergi was trying to revive this idea too of a United States of Europe, which was a false play on words, right? Because the United States was able to set up an economic system that allowed for the 13 colonies to basically have an economic system that you would want for a country, right? Instead of like 13 separate entities, you're not going to have very efficient trade. You're also not going to have, good collaboration, because if you want certain projects done, you're not going to be able to necessarily have all of that industrial capability in one location. And Germany was also starting to use that idea with the Zollverein. And so Britain and, other empires, they're very good at stealing good ideas, and they kind of twist it around and they try to make it seem like it's the same idea, but it in fact isn't the same thing. So they had twisted around this idea saying, well, we're going to have a United States of Europe, it's the exact opposite, right? Because the American plan is for the support of sovereign nation states, whereas what they were proclaiming for the United States of Europe was that now all of the European countries were going to be reduced to the status of a colony, a United States of Europe, right? They would be the colonies of Europe, which would be beholden to ultimately the British Empire. So Kalergi was pushing for this plan in the United States, and he wasn't getting anywhere because Roosevelt was blocking him. And he even says that in his autobiography, that he was really disappointed because Roosevelt never even agreed to meet with him. So there's, I think, a very strong case to support that Roosevelt was clearly not for these ideas when it came to action. And his idea was the Big Four, which again Kalergi scoffs at in his autobiography, and to which Stalin too, in power, this was going to be a very effective plan, which was that Roosevelt viewed that there would be an increased decolonialization after World War II. So it wasn't just a war against fascism. It was ultimately a war against imperialism. And I think a lot of people too they get confused because the Italian fascists and the German fascists, they called themselves National Socialists. They weren't National Socialists, they were imperialists. And if you look at everything that they were thinking of in terms of ideology and so forth, it's clearly imperial, to the point where they even viewed Africa as the breadbasket for Europe. So Roosevelt was for this increased decolonialization, but he was realistic, right? A lot of these countries that are coming out of maybe even over 100 years of being a colony, you're not going to be able to just like stand on your own 2 feet right away. And it's going to be a vulnerable situation for these countries. As Churchill rightfully makes the point in his Iron Curtain speech, he's saying, well, that's why Britain's imperial power have to be kept in place, because if not, the Soviets are going to take over all of these countries if we walk out of them. What Roosevelt was proposing is that you have the big four, which would be Britain, the United States, Russia, and China, supposedly all the countries who very much were against fascism, right? Because France, it fell. You had the Vichy government. But Britain wasn't actually against fascism. If you look at all of the really kind of big players in Britain, they were pretty much all for fascism. It's just they were, some were much more public about it, and some were willing to play a longer game to see it through. So Roosevelt proposed that under the overseeing of these big four, and he made it clear that you would have to have, 2 from the West and 2 from the East for it to be more balanced. So you wouldn't have this kind of Cold War division, this East and West Iron Curtain, that these countries would be kind of like, you could say, the temporary stewards for these countries to protect them. And because you had the splitting of the interest, but everyone's on the same page, there was going to be less likely, a case where you would have an Iron Curtain type situation. I think that with Roosevelt and Stalin overseeing that was going to be a totally feasible plan. Obviously, it depends on who's going to oversee something like that. If you were going to have Truman overseeing something like that, it wasn't going to work. So unfortunately, Roosevelt died, a few months before the end of the war, and it was 2 weeks before the first United Nations conference. And that conference, Kalergi also writes about it in his autobiography, was very important because it was going to decide the nature of what the United Nations was going to be. And it was a very clear takeover of what the original concept was, even from Kalergi's own biased, view in his autobiography, where they actually even had a vote on this particular idea of regionalization, and that was accepted. So at that point, the United Nations was effectively transformed into a League of Nations concept.
And we see where it's gotten to today. And it's remarkable, especially when we look at what has been happening within the United Nations, and that fascism never died. I mean, you hit a vital point here. There were many in London, specifically the city of London, that loved the idea of fascism. And there were many in Wall Street that loved it as well. And we see the continued funding of various projects right after the war, right after World War II, within the United States and within Europe at large. Cynthia, could you speak further on that, please?
Yeah, well, you've had Alex Craner on a few times. He did a very good paper on how Britain, it was because of Britain's intervention that Germany had acquired such a strong army, for one, with the Munich Agreement or Munich Betrayal, that the Czechs actually had the strongest army, and that because of the British dubious diplomatic, kind of intervention in this whole thing, they somehow created a situation where the Czechs were led to believe that certain things were going to happen, and instead the Germans were basically given the rights to access to that military. And Alex makes the point that if Germany hadn't acquired that army, they would not have been anywhere near as big of a threat militarily, and that it was very likely at this point in time that France and the Soviet Union were going to be able to nip that in the bud right away. But increasingly, France started to take a step back. They were working with Britain and basically agreed to unleash Hitler onto the Soviet Union. And again, you see with France, right? Because like when Hitler, made his first maneuver, which launched the war, World War II. I don't know how many people are aware that I think it's the first 6 months of World War II is called the phony war.
Interesting. Wow.
Because yeah, Britain was the one who officially declared it, right? In France, like a good little puppy follows along. But it's called the phony war because it was said in words that the war is launched, but there was actually no action against Hitler. And at the time, people should also be aware Mussolini was not in support of Hitler, and Mussolini's fascism was actually pretty popular. It was very trendy, you know, and in France and Britain and the United States. And so the phony war period only ends when Hitler enters France.
Wow.
And the Vichy government is established, and then it's like, okay, maybe we should actually like do a little bit to intervene. And the thing is, Susan Butler wrote a terrific book on the Roosevelt-Stalin partnership. I forgot the exact title, but it's pretty much around that as the title. And she did a really amazing job just collecting so many memos and quotes from all of the people that played very large roles in this. And that was actually the book that kind of introduced me to the personality of Stalin without all of the clear baggage that is often unloaded on people whenever his name comes up, because she's bringing up basically the transcriptions of meetings, discussions, and so forth. So it's a lot more unbiased that way. And it's what was I talking about? I totally went blank.
No, you hit a valuable point. Most people don't realize that the first 6 months of the war was just rhetoric. They were saying war,
yeah,
before the actual shooting began. So we've had 6 months of media bombardment, political, fanning the flames, so to speak, into a fever pitch before the first bullet even began to fly.
Yeah, and that happened after Britain had already given an army to Hitler, and also the Bank of England and the Bank of International Settlements were involved in taking about 5.6 million pounds from the Czech bank as well to supply Hitler's army. And it's more than that too, though. There's so much more that I haven't looked into, you know, in detail, the banking structure, but like Alan Dulles and Foster Dulles through their law firm Sullivan and Cromwell. Also, Alan Dulles was a prominent member, and you know, he was president at one point and several other titles of the Council on Foreign Relations, again, the American branch of Chatham House. And he was also a prominent he basically had his own underground OSS that he was running, which again, David Talbot's book, which goes over Alan Dulles's career with a lot of focus, he makes the point that John Loftus, who's this Nazi hunter, he is of the view that Roosevelt allowed Alan Dulles such a free rein because he was keeping tabs on him, seeing who Alan Dulles was rubbing elbows with, because there was always the intention of the Nuremberg trials afterwards, which again, Roosevelt wasn't able to oversee. And so there was the intention to expose a lot with the kind of intel that he was collecting, according to John Loftus. So you had an incredible amount of support. J.P. Morgan, too. Actually, Oswald Mosley's second wife, Diana, we have a letter with her writing to the Nazis saying that she's going to hook up a meeting between, you know, Morgan House and the Henry Schroeder Bank to see what they can do for the funding of Hitler and so forth. So pretty much all of the the reason why I brought up the Dulles is because they were also involved in the rearming Germany by night as well. They're very, very involved in building up Germany during this entire period after the Treaty of Versailles, but to basically radicalize Germany. And again, this was an attack on what Germany had as a potential for the good. And that Germany had to be dismantled because it posed a threat under its economic powerhouse as a sovereign nation state. So that's the other thing that people like. Germany has such a beautiful culture, right? Like they had created so many geniuses in like the classical music and in drama, in literature, in the sciences, and so forth. Even France too, right? Leibniz was studying in France. He chose to study in France because that's where all the best scientists were. So these countries had a lot of potential for a great deal of good. And that's what is really sad about the interventions that happened in the 20th century. And Germany went through a lot too with the Congress of Vienna during the 19th century to also try to like cut that out of them. And German Romanticism, which has connections with the later on Nazism. You know, it's not irrelevant that Hitler liked Wagner. Wagner was a consequence of cultural interventions that were clearly being made within Germany to take advantage of certain things that they kind of had in their ideological view from their more, I guess you could say, pagan days. Carl Jung is also a product of this kind of problem, but Germany was basically cut down twice from the two world wars because it actually presented something that was very powerful for the good. And it also was the bridge always to Russia, right? So that's also why Germany has had a special relationship, which I think people don't really understand historically, with Russia. And it's not so unnatural for Germany to be, a kind of brother to Russia. Same thing with the United States when you
Correct.
look historically at like what the relationship has been with Russia intervening in favor of supporting Lincoln during the Civil War, because Britain and France wanted to intervene for the Confederate States in service to the slave empire that was based on cotton and opium. Yeah.
You know, that's a very good point. We've said it often and often again on the show. I mean, Americans, Russians, and Germans, the natural fit, and the powers that be keep these countries separate and against each other as enemies, because they understand that a united front with the U.S. being part of the multipolar world is absolutely detrimental to the financier class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And people need to understand that the Roosevelt's New Deal, which again was very attacked, I think I make a very good point in this book that if you look at a lot of the people who were attacking Roosevelt's New Deal, they were again for fascism. And Keynes, who was, pretty public with his support of fascism to the point where his book, I forgot which book it was that was printed in Nazi Germany, he even said that his version of the New Deal, right? Because they had to try to appropriate it to their own twisted cause, because Roosevelt's New Deal was like a really big thing. It was going to change everything, right? Economically. Keynes was trying to introduce a totalitarian idea of a New Deal, right? Because when you have centralized management, it can be totalitarian, but it can also be something very useful. So he was trying to promote that version. He said in his publication for the Nazi Germany version that his system was meant for a totalitarian system. That's also why James Burnham in his Managerial Revolution, he says that, you have either the choice of Nazi Germany for this manager's, rule, the new rule of the technocrats, pretty much. You have Nazi Germany, or you have Stalin's Soviet Union, or you have Roosevelt's New Deal type concept. And that's, again, it's dishonest way of putting all of those groupings together. But it was essentially, they knew that they would have to make tweaks to this, but it was this idea of just utilizing any kind of centralized power. That's not to say that the answer is to decentralize government either. People have to basically understand what is proper economic policy. Like, they have to become economically literate. If you're illiterate in any idea, in any sphere of knowledge, you will always be taken advantage of. And that's where the problem lies, is that people have been fed bad science, bad philosophy, bad economics in the 20th century in a very purposeful way to dumb people down to not realize what is for the best.
I mean, the book that I think John Maynard Keynes wrote, I think it was Gesellschaft theory. I think it was in Germany, where he was talking about his version of fascism and how it'd be integrated to the wider European continent.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm not familiar with the name, but he most definitely did that.
absolutely. Cynthia, the Black Sun that never said. How did fascism really take root after World War II in the United States, and how did it springboard to many, moving out of the realm of think tanks and roundtables into very policy, especially the foreign policy of the United States?
Well, this is volume 1 of a volume 2 series. So in volume 2, I'm going to go through a lot more of the cultural, ideological, occult aspects of how fascism arose. But and a very important element too that I want to say before I forget is that again, the reason why the Italians and the Germans they were calling themselves the National Socialists, and you have James Burnham, right, who's working with Trotsky and so forth, but ultimately he's also a fan of the Italian fascists. He writes a book called the Machiavellians, which is basically off of these 3 prominent Italian fascists who called themselves the Machiavellians. And Georges Sorel, they were very much influenced by this guy, who plays a very prominent role in this idea of basically using socialism towards the cause of fascism. So I know that for me, this was a very confusing subject of like why you had all of these different groupings of communists, and some communists actually were like really resisting fascism, as we see, like in the case of Italy and Greece, you had the communists who were really at the forefront of fighting fascists, but then you have other groupings of communists or Marxists, and they were on the side of fascism. And basically, Georges Sorel was of this idea that he had revised Marxism so that there could be this infiltration of socialism to convert it to fascism. And there was no coincidence that the Germans and the Italians called themselves National Socialists, because they were on the same page for that kind of a blueprint. In terms of what happened after World War II, the pan-Europe concept is very integral, right? The United Nations being taken over as a League of Nations concept is integral, but also there were stay-behind armies that became the secret army of NATO. And this was originally implemented by Churchill. So again, after Roosevelt died, Churchill had had thought up Operation Unthinkable, which was considering 2 scenarios where one, you would need stay-behind armies in case the Soviet Union were to invade Western Europe after the Nazis were defeated. And scenario 2, that the West would actually launch an attack on the Soviet Union without the Soviet Union having done anything except fight the fascists. So obviously that one was going to be a harder one to justify. So a lot of people think that Operation Unthinkable never was carried through, but actually that first blueprint was carried through. There were secret armies that stayed behind, including run by Nazis, and the West was immediately in support of this. So Nazis, fascists were immediately incorporated into a military structure within the Western sphere, and also the surveillance system. Like, I think Reinhard Gehlen is a pretty well-known case that he was brought back to oversee West Germany's security apparatus, and he was a top Nazi who was running the intelligence aspect of the Nazis. And actually Franz Six, who played a big role in organizing what would be the Nazi planned invasion of Britain, he also was a part of this Gehlen organization. Alan Dulles played a big role in, setting this up as well. And he was, for whatever reason, put in prison for like two or 4 years or something, was released, and he was allowed to again rejoin the Gehlen organization. You have Otto Skorzeny, who's a really prominent, he basically is a very high level player for the Gladio which is basically the stay behind armies. And he later on did a lot of training in the Middle East. He trained the Egyptian army. He trained a lot of other armies within the Middle East in terror tactics. And that's basically what the focus was when the Soviet Union never invaded, they actually justified that there was a need to create terrorist acts against the citizens of Europe and to even violently remove elected leaders under the guise of communist terrorists. It's not to say that there weren't communist terrorism, but when you look at the really big incidents that have happened historically, they have largely been proved at this point to have come from this apparatus, unfortunately. And and it's very much tied into what we see today in terms of the Islamic terrorism. None of these things are natural phenomenons, but they're there to create terror so that you can move people towards the goal of, less civil liberties and more towards a justification for far right-wing government type policies, which we see now to an extreme degree today.
And this stay behind force, this eventually led to Operation Gladio, I assume.
Yes, this became it's called Gladio because that was the name of the Italian secret armies, and it just ended up being the name used for all of them. And it was only like fairly recently exposed. It was in the early 90s in Italy that like there was a whole controversy, and it was found out that there was these stay behind armies because Italy went through it a very difficult time. They went through about 2 decades or more of what is called the Years of Lead, where they had a lot of terrorist attacks, and people like Aldo Moro were killed that are suspected to have been killed by this apparatus. Basically the OPC as well, the rogue branch of the CIA, was under Alan Dulles and Frank Wisner, was working for this element of Gladio. Again, Gladio being just like the word for it on an international scale at this point. And the Frank Church Senate Committee hearings, the infamous, Church Senate Committee hearings that were investigating the CIA for their criminal actions, basically, even said that the reason for the OPC's formation was largely justified to intervene in European elections, and that Italy was the first country where they intervened in a post-World War II election, again, to make sure that there wasn't going to be any communists gaining ground, and that it was going to be, the fascists, in this case, the Christian Democrats in Italy, who held fascists within that party, who were going to hold control. People also should be aware that in Greece, Greece later became a central branch of Gladio. And it's a really sad story because Greece was really doing well fighting against the fascists. They had fought Mussolini's forces out of Greece. And then you had the Nazis who came in, and Britain was originally fighting side by side the Greeks. But then in 1943, Churchill decides the Greek communists are doing too well. So the British forces were told to basically start fighting the Greek communists in the midst of fighting the Nazis. In 1943, and also in support of reinstating the corrupt king that they had overthrown, who was in support of fascism and a totalitarian system. And there's even Daniel Ganser did a really great book, NATO's Secret Armies, where Britain even has the public statement that Britain will always support the monarchy. And so the British basically tortured and imprisoned, terrorized the Greeks during this period. And then there was a certain point, because the Greeks kept fighting, that the British just didn't have the resources or whatever. So they asked the Americans to come in, and this was the formation of the Truman Doctrine, which was the the justification for the United States entry into a whole bunch of other countries afterwards. This was what started the whole thing. And the Americans entered Greece to start fighting the communists as well. This went on after World War II. It continued the fight. And they actually had chemical warfare. They poured napalm on the Greek people because they did not accept the outcome that there could be a communist government in Greece, despite them having fought the fascists. And Greece was eventually subdued and made a NATO member. And at that point, Athens has been a Gladio stronghold where a lot of the Middle East Gladio operations were launched out of Athens, which recently one of the Turkey ministers even referenced that is still going on.
Very well said. Very important points. Where are we today, right now, with this fashion? I know you're working on a secondary novel, but actually, even better yet, what are some of the main highlights of what you've written in regards to the Black Sun that never set?
Again, for this book, it doesn't really focus on the occult directly. So I don't really go too much into any of those elements, which it's a super interesting subject. This volume 2 is going to be scary, but also a lot of fun to write. But I would say, instead of focusing on the occult because this book doesn't focus on the occult volume 2 well, it does go over the concept of scientific fascism, which again, the Fabian Society plays a big role in this, and H.G. Wells is not some innocent sci-fi writer. Oswald Mosley even says that his view for scientific fascism was basically the model that he chose to follow and continued to follow, after World War II. So where we are today, in terms of this kind of, science gone haywire, was very much, again, the view that you can trace back even to Thomas Huxley, in terms of the kinds of interventions that they were making in the sciences with the advent of Darwinism. And there's no coincidence that the Fabian Society was promoting Marxism and Darwinism at the same time, but ultimately towards the goal of a fascist state. And that Britain basically was not able to do anything without having taken over the United States. So the United States, basically became a kind of hollowed out, kind of appendage to the British Empire after World War II, especially seen with the signing of the NSC 75, where the United States actually said, to defend the free world, we're going to have to defend British colonial interests. It pretty much says that verbatim.
Insane. Absolutely insane.
Yeah. So I would say that the reason why I wrote this, which I think is very important for people to read, and there's a lot that I didn't cover in this interview. I also go through the City of London. I go through the heroin trade and how this fits into funding these types of structures, Nixon's war on drugs, and I go through the Mufti of Jerusalem, as well as some other stuff. But the reason why I want to go through this is because I think that people they largely don't want to look at history. I find too many people are not interested in history. But the thing is that today, we're being fed a lot of lies, or there's a lot of people who've just kind of recently, you could say, woke up and are trying to explain things to other people that, you can't just expect to take a leadership role just like that without knowing how we got here. And there's a lot of a blame game going on, especially in blaming Russia and China for all of the ills in the world. But if you look at this historical trajectory, it's very clear that that is not the case. And by understanding where this came from, and also understanding what was opposing this, you can look at that kind of structure and see that the solutions actually lie within this study of history. And the solution is a lot of people are kind of like, they feel that it's hopeless at this point, but that's exactly what they were saying during World War II. They said there's no point in resisting Nazism. It's a done deal. And we see now that was if people had gone through with that, that would have been a really bad outcome. And we're in a very similar situation today. We're actually in a better situation because there's actually more opposition internationally to this fascist world order that's trying to be re-implemented. And people have to become aware that there is that other side that's opposing this, and that there's some very competent, economic solutions to this as well, because it ultimately, a huge chunk of this lies in your economic policy, because the economic policy ultimately defines how you view your people, how you define humankind. Do you define humankind as cattle, or do you define humankind as a creative individual that has worth in your society?
Absolutely. Very well said, Cynthia. Very well said. And when is your book available?
It's available.
Fantastic. And folks, you can get the book over at, I believe it's the risingtidefoundation.net.
Well, the best way to do it is to go through my Substack, Cynthia Chung, substack.com, Through a Glass Darkly. You can also find it on Amazon, The Empire in Which the Black Sun Never Set, The Birth of International Fascism and Anglo-American Foreign Policy.
Fantastic. Cynthia, thank you so much for joining us and sharing this amazing insight with us. Once again, folks, get the book, The Black Sun Never Set, The Birth of International Fascism and the Anglo-American Foreign Policy. Amazing read. I can't wait to get it for myself. Cynthia, thank you once again.
No problem.
Thank you all for listening in.